How to Be a Poet by Wendell Berry. Make a place to sit down. Sit down, be quiet. Breathe with unconditional breath the unconditioned air. Shun electric wire. Communicate slowly. Live a three-dimensional life. Stay away from screens. Stay away from anything that obscures the place it is in. There are no unsacred places. There are only sacred places and desecrated places. This is our call to worship on this sixth Sunday of Easter. I'm Pastor Rielly with Windsor Mennonite Fellowship. Now, when the quarantine first started, there was this day when I was driving around Windsor, scouting out local places to film our online video series. I was a significant distance from my home when it hit me. Certain regions of my body suddenly sent signals to my brain. A biological function was requesting permission to engage. In other words, I needed to find somewhere to go. You know, like go. My bladder needed relief, okay? I can handle this. I'll just find the closest McDonald's or Tim Hortons. Wait a second. We're under quarantine. None of the usual public restrooms were open. Okay, I'm a guy, plan B, find an obscure private bush, all will be well. I continued driving around and looking for a private and appropriate place to relieve myself, but to no avail. I was in the middle of the day, broad daylight, people and families were walking around. Plan B was a no-go. I repeat, no-go. I'm discovering that the older that I get, the less amount of time I can hold it, as though there is this sliding scale. As my age goes up, the length of time I can hold my bladder goes down. So the situation was growing dire, needless to say. I definitely couldn't hold it long enough to get home. All the usual public restrooms were closed, and there were no private places I could go au naturel. I needed to find a place to go, and quick. That's when it occurred to me. It must have been the Holy Spirit. Rielly, your friends Dan and Andrea live nearby. Maybe they'll let you go in their backyard. Yes, I know. Desperate times call for desperate measures. And in becoming desperate, I grabbed my phone and swiftly texted my friends, and here is that ridiculous text message, word for word. Hi friends, smiley face. This is probably the most bizarre and random question I've ever asked anyone, ever. Can I pee in your backyard? I'm in your end of town, can't get home in time, and desperately need to go. I can't think of anywhere to safely do the deed in this quarantine without getting myself into trouble for public urination. Thankfully, they immediately replied, and after some laughs and a friendly bit of mockery, they agreed. I successfully relieved myself without much time to spare. Hi. We all need somewhere to go. And by go, I don't just mean relieving ourselves. The absence of a public restroom during the quarantine strangely reminded me that the concept of place is pretty darn important. We all need all kinds of physical spaces and places to live and thrive. We are a people tied to geographies we inhabit. Whether it's seeking places to be inspired or to explore, like in mountains and deserts and forests and rivers, to concert venues and movie theaters, we also need places to relate to one another and to feel safe, like the family home or a special room in your house, a neighborhood, a support group, certain restaurants or cafes and churches and bars and clubs. We have places to go about our work, our play, our places to rest, and places to worship. Even those suffering from homelessness, I've learned, place is crucial. Somewhere safe, warm, and dry. We all need places to go. The Creator has created in us a sense of place and a need for thriving in social and physical spaces, be it for our survival or for our mental, emotional, relational, or spiritual health. But in a time like this, our places are limited, as they should be in a quarantine. But limited confinement can be a difficult task. It's nothing compared to something like solitary confinement, but that doesn't mean it's not tough. I really miss sharing space with my family. In particular, my little niece and nephew, Elliot and Daisy. Elliot's 3.5, Daisy's 2.5. I miss them running into my arms with unfettered jubilation when I walk into my brother's apartment and they shout, "Uncle Rielly, Uncle Rielly!" To experience or share physical space with the people that we love can be a mysterious energy of hope, profoundly positive, and a deep sense of longing can come over us when we are absent from those same spaces. In the Gospel of John, chapter 1, there is this verse that's always fascinated me. In the passage, it says that God, the Word, became flesh and dwelt among us. This is a wonderful mystery. I don't think we'll ever truly comprehend all the nuances. But if it means anything, we need to focus on the operational word here, to dwell. The Greek word for dwell means to encamp. It's like to set up a tent or to tabernacle. That God became a human tabernacle in Jesus. And God doesn't set up shop in an existing church or temple or castle or in the halls of power. God's presence sets up shop in a humble Middle Eastern peasant, among the places of the everyday and ordinary us. The Old English word translated as dwelt means to enter fully into physical space and to linger, to tarry or to delay, to inhabit. Of all the things we dwell on during quarantine, do you dwell upon and truly dwell in the physical places that you live in and inhabit and share with other people as the location to encounter God in our midst? Do you pray with the physical space around you, and do you fully enter into that place, its history, its feelings, the demographics, the entire atmosphere of the place that you live? Do you merely own property or rent a space or live in a house, or do you dwell there with everybody? If Jesus is not only our Savior, but our pattern for life, our guide, I think it means we're also meant to be a people who know what it truly means to dwell in our places, to bind ourselves spiritually and physically to the geographic locations that we inhabit. The Gospel of John essentially says that with open arms, like my little niece and nephew, God fully entered into a place, and Jesus willingly limited himself to a local geography. Perhaps you know Eugene Peterson's translation, the modern translation of John chapter 1, verse 14, which says, "The Word became flesh and moved into the neighborhood." Jesus shows us that the kingdom of God first is to fully dwell in the world. But do we know how to dwell? Barbara Brown Taylor says it this way in her book, An Altar in the World, A Geography of Faith. Human beings may separate things into as many piles as they wish, separating spirit from flesh, sacred from secular, church from world. But we should not be surprised when God does not recognize the distinctions we make between the two. Earth is so thick with divine possibility that it is a wonder we can walk anywhere without cracking shins on altars. I love that. Our task, like Jesus, is to truly inhabit the places that we live and knock our shins against the altars of God everywhere. Not just simply in church buildings, that's kind of boring to me, but everywhere. Even during a pandemic, we have special places and spaces, but to God, everywhere is sacred. As Wendell Berry says, there are no unsacred places, only sacred places and desecrated places. But Jesus now shows us the presence of God through the neighborhoods that he lived in, but particularly by encouraging us to notice, to consider that the physicality and spirituality of all things are one and the same, not separate realities. He tells stories about farmers and landowners. He uses everyday things like the sparrows and fig trees. He teaches us about loving our neighbors and our enemies, especially when they are the same person. Jesus shows us the divine possibility all around us. This is why, in part, I've been sharing this series with you, Local Hope in a Hot Mess. Turning into our local places and spaces, I think, can help us be surprised by God in the midst of our discomfort of being limited in where we can go and what we can do. Because we can join the one who is the ultimate example of inhabiting and dwelling in a place. And this brings us to our setting for today. My neighborhood front porch. This is my street. This is where I live, where I call home, where I've lived for a few years now. It used to be farmland, and only a few houses stood around here, built by the Scottish immigrants as far back as 150 years ago. Before that, it was a hunting and migration trail for the indigenous peoples. I'm still getting to know my neighbors in this place, and I have a long way to go to learn how to really dwell like Jesus dwells in a place. But I've noticed the joys and challenges of inhabiting here for just a short amount of time. For example, one neighbor of mine regularly steps out of his house with a big red cap which says, "Make Canada Great Again." And admittedly, I bristle. Not a fan. But to my shame, when he heard about my work, he generously began supporting my chaplaincy ministry to ex-offenders in the community. Ouch. On the other end, I have a pleasant but private, non-binary gay neighbor whose smile is bright and friendly. I hear occasionally the beautiful and reverent call to worship from a nearby mosque and Muslim school. I observe the people of color on my street, as well as some of the more nervous white folks that are frequently calling the cops on an Airbnb 2 houses over. I have neighbors who are nurses and pharmacists and landscapers. There are young families here, and there are retirees. There's an elderly man who is hard of hearing. I thought at first he was ignoring me when I said hello. But he lives alone, right down the street here. And I see him sitting in his reading chair under a lamp by his front window almost every night. And I wonder if he's lonely. I have another neighborhood friend who has told me on a few occasions he will get questioned while walking up our street. What are you doing? Do you live here? My friend is a person of color. I walked up and down my street many times and never been questioned if I belong here. The dynamics are complex on this small little street in Windsor, Ontario. There are tensions and conflicts, differences, all the dynamics of life in my neighborhood parish. Tenants and landlords, the rich and the poor, the young and the old. I've discovered the neighborhood is really an image of what the church is called to look like. All sorts of different people from all walks of life gathered together in physical proximity, trying to figure out how to live together in harmony, with all our messes and beauty woven together. It's almost like neighborhoods were meant to be our churches. So I'd like to suggest something for you to consider. Maybe your first church is not your congregation, it's your neighborhood. And therefore, right now, during quarantine, you don't need to go anywhere to go to church. You're already there. If you have the eyes to see and the ears to hear the presence of God. If you want to be like Jesus, dwell fully in your neighborhood. The people in your neighborhood that you pass by and see every day are made in the image of God. So if you want to encounter the presence of God in your life, move first towards the small, the local, not the big things, the grandiose things, but the life in your neighborhood. The image of God is walking past your front porch every single day. This brings up a question in my mind. Where exactly is this thing called church? Where does it happen? There's talk about reopening church buildings right now as the province gradually reopens, and some are more eager than others. But in some ways, this is strange to me because my church, Windsor Mennonite Fellowship, was never closed in the first place. Sure, our building was closed, but our church has been in full operation since the pandemic began. This week, there was a CBC article about a letter some churches wrote and signed to the Premier of Ontario, wanting to reopen so that they could gather again and engage in pastoral duties. I have a number of concerns about a letter like this, but I'd like to focus on one issue for the sake of our reflections this morning. In part, the letter said, and I quote, "Neither confessional Christian faith nor the Church Institute can faithfully exist without a Lord's Day gathering." I read this and thought, really? We can't faithfully exist? Like I said, my church hadn't stopped existing or celebrating the Lord's Day, Sunday. But Sabbath, Sunday, worship services, or gatherings are a necessary part of our faith. But the letter is talking about opening their church buildings. Is gathering in a church building the same thing and of equal value? Can we not faithfully exist without the Lord's Day gathering in a church building? Is our faith so dependent on a particular structure? They seem to be asking about opening their church buildings as if being a faithful Christian were one and the same thing. Why is it so necessary, especially when things like communal singing and large public gatherings are proven ways the virus is transmitted? Why would Christian leaders push the issue? Well, I think there's a historical reason behind this push. Churches have leaned on a dominant empire understanding of the concept of church for a long time. They don't want to reopen the church. It was never closed. They want to reopen Christendom. I'll explain what that is in a moment. But did you know that for the first 300 years of church history, no Christian would have ever experienced a church building? We see them everywhere today. But among the early Christians and the following 300 years, churches primarily met in homes and courtyards and underground. An example of this in the book of Acts, from chapter 5, verse 42, says that every day the disciples, the apostles, taught in the temple courtyards and from house to house. Over and over again in the book of Acts, we see people meeting in homes and courtyards to celebrate the Lord's Day. When people spoke of the church in the first 300 years, it was a way of describing all Christians in a particular city or town, not a building, not a denomination. For example, the Church of Ephesus or the Church of Rome just meant it was all Christians who lived there in Ephesus or in Rome. See, Christians were tied to the geography of the regions they lived. And if we follow church history, church buildings emerge as a privilege, not a right, and in many cases part of an empire collusion of church and state religion, not as a necessary function of faithful believers. So where did church buildings come from? Around 300 CE, the Emperor Constantine made Christianity the state religion. And everything that comes with that joined in: military, geographic, colonial expansion. Now Christianity was associated with the sword. And this included building massive cathedrals, demonstrations of the power of the empire. This is the beginning of church buildings. Christianity became a symbol of the Roman Empire, and thus began the era of what we know as Christendom. But Christendom, as an empire, has not always served us well. But before that time, once again, no Christian would have ever shadowed the doors of a church, ever. They met in small groups, in homes and outdoors, sometimes every day. Now, it's certainly not wrong to enjoy the architecture and inspiration of church cathedrals. They can be awe-inspiring and worshipful. And it's important to curate spaces where one can sing, pray, gather, and learn from the scriptures together. And we have these freedoms in Canada, and we're grateful for them. And you know what? We need each other. We need to connect and relate to one another. My point here is, in joining with the faithful church throughout the ages, they really believed that the church was wherever 2 or 3 were gathered. Jesus was present with them in their homes and in their neighborhoods, in their courtyards, in catacombs. So why can't that be the same today? Especially when our most vulnerable are at risk in large gatherings. What I think this discussion about reopening church buildings in North America and this letter to the Premier has done is shed a light on our true operational values. The difference between Christendom, which is empire expressions of Christianity, buildings and crowds and consumers, on one hand, and a faithful, Christ-like presence in a neighborhood or community, which is a creative engine that does not require a building or a performative pep rally or gathering to be a church. Christendom, or a faithful Christ-like presence. What are our values? And not just in theory, but in how we operate. See, most Christians know and agree that God doesn't live in a church building. But when the rubber hits the road, like in a quarantine, when we cannot gather in church buildings, how we operate disavows what we profess. Because sadly, many Christians' primary experience of God is tied to a physical building and the words of clergy. So many modern Christians today have been discipled across all denominations into a faith that is so small and uncreative, they don't know how to experience God independent of their buildings and institutions, which say, oh, God is everywhere. Yeah, we know that, but you have to come here to get it. Churches and pastors haven't always equipped their people to practice and experience a faith on their own. Pastors end up often believing for the people as a surrogate. If the pastor is certain, confident, and has no doubts, then the people are certain, confident, and have no doubts. And you need to come to this building to get your fix of that certainty. So right now, maybe it's not church people are missing, but Christendom. And they're going through a type of drug detox withdrawal because they need their fix by getting back in their buildings, even to the detriment of vulnerable people and the larger community. So I think, in conclusion, it's time to decenter our church buildings, not get rid of them. I think they can be wonderful tools. But it's only as good as our ability, they're only as useful as our ability to return back to being a local presence in our neighborhoods first and foremost. If we don't know how to do the latter, we won't be able to do the former well. There's this line from poet Gerard Manley Hopkins that I love. He writes, "Christ plays in 10,000 places, lovely in limbs and lovely in eyes not his." If you want to experience God, don't start looking for God by big flashy signs. Begin by dwelling in your neighborhood. See God in the small everyday things. This is where God dwells among us. Seeing the image of Jesus in your neighbors, they're the ones that pass you by every day. Your first church is your neighborhood. So now may you discover the place you are in. May you discover church there. And may it help us re-envision together and rediscover together the calling of the church in Windsor to be a faithful, Christ-like presence to our community instead of a distant, cloistered, homogeneous tribe looking for power in a world of competing empires. Now may you go from here in peace to love and serve the Lord where you are.